The betrayal came on a Tuesday. I was polishing the gleaming surface of my restored 1967 Mustang, a dream I'd spent 5 years building, when my phone buzzed with my mother-in-law's name. That call revealed how my husband's family had sold my most prized possession without my knowledge, all to fund my sister-in-law's latest self-discovery retreat in Sedona. Sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who see you as nothing but a resource to be drained, and that day I discovered just how far my in-laws would go to take what was mine. The relationship between a woman and her in-laws is often complicated, but I never expected mine to become the architects of my deepest betrayal. Before everything fell apart, my life had settled into a comfortable rhythm that I'd fought hard to create. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Natalie Carson, 32 years old, with a career as a mechanical engineer that I'd built from the ground up. I'd married Ryan 4 years ago after dating for 3. He was everything I thought I wanted: supportive, kind, with an easy laugh that made even the worst days bearable. We'd bought a modest house in Willow Creek, a suburb just outside of Portland, with a 2-car garage that had sold me on the property instantly. That garage was my sanctuary. While some people dreamed of walk-in closets or gourmet kitchens, I had always wanted a space where I could pursue my passion: classic car restoration. Growing up, my father had taught me everything about engines, transmissions, and bodywork. We'd spent countless weekends under the hood of whatever project car he'd brought home, his patience never wavering as he explained each component, each connection. "Cars are honest," he used to say. "They don't lie about what they need, and they reward you for paying attention." When my father passed away from cancer 5 years ago, he left me his tools, his knowledge, and enough money for one big project. I knew exactly what I wanted: a 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback in Highland Green. It had been our dream car, the one we'd always talked about restoring together someday. I found her in a junkyard 3 states away, rusted, gutted, barely recognizable. But I could see the potential beneath the decades of neglect. Ryan had been supportive then, driving with me to haul it back, listening patiently as I rambled about torque specifications and period-correct details. "You're cute when you're obsessed," he'd say, and I'd roll my eyes but appreciate the space he gave me to pursue this connection to my father. For 5 years, I poured every spare moment and dollar into that car. I worked overtime to afford original parts, stayed up until dawn researching authentic restoration techniques, and built relationships with specialized mechanics across the country who could guide me through the trickier aspects. The Mustang became more than a car. It was my legacy, my therapy, my tribute to the man who had shaped me. Ryan's family had always viewed my passion with a mixture of amusement and bewilderment. His parents, Harold and Diane, were practical, conventional people who saw cars as nothing more than transportation. "Couldn't you have picked a cheaper hobby?" Harold would joke whenever he visited, not understanding that this wasn't about money, but about connection. Ryan's sister Valerie was another story entirely. 3 years younger than Ryan, she drifted through life on a perpetual journey of self-discovery that seemed to require constant financial support from her parents, and by extension, from us. Every few months brought a new passion: yoga instructor training in Bali, silent retreats in Arizona, crystal healing certification in Sedona. Each venture lasted just long enough for the novelty to wear off before she'd announce her next calling. "Val's just sensitive," Ryan would explain whenever I expressed frustration at her constant requests for loans that were never repaid. "She's trying to find her purpose." I bit my tongue more times than I could count, reminding myself that family dynamics were complicated and that my own passionate pursuit of car restoration probably seemed just as frivolous to them. 6 months ago, I finally finished the Mustang. Every chrome detail gleamed, the engine purred with a deep, satisfying rumble, and the Highland Green paint caught the light in exactly the way I'd imagined it would. The day I took it for its first real drive was the closest thing to perfect happiness I'd felt since my father died. I could almost feel him in the passenger seat, nodding with approval. "You did good, kiddo," I could hear him say. "She's a beauty." Ryan took me out to celebrate, genuinely happy for me even if he didn't fully understand the magnitude of what I'd accomplished. "Maybe now you can take up a normal hobby," he teased over champagne, like scrapbooking or something less expensive. I'd laughed, but in retrospect, I should have paid more attention to the subtle implication that my passion was somehow a phase to be completed rather than an ongoing part of my identity. Our marriage had been solid, or so I thought. We had our routines, Sunday morning coffee on the porch, alternating who chose the movie on Friday nights, small compromises that made sharing a life possible. Ryan worked as a marketing director for a local brewery, a job that kept him busy but rarely stressed. I handled our finances, partly because I was better with numbers and partly because money conversations made Ryan uncomfortable. His discomfort with financial discussions should have been a red flag, but I interpreted it as a quirk rather than a warning sign. He'd grown up in a household where money was never discussed openly, where his parents handled everything and the children were kept in a state of financial ignorance that they called protection. My in-laws lived about 40 minutes away, close enough for regular Sunday dinners but far enough to maintain healthy boundaries. Harold, a retired high school principal, filled his days with golf and community board positions that made him feel important. Diane had never worked outside the home and devoted herself to maintaining a perfect household and managing her children's lives well into their adulthood. They had always been politely distant with me, never hostile, but never truly welcoming either. I was the odd puzzle piece in their family picture. Too independent, too focused on my career, too uninterested in the superficial niceties that Diane valued so highly. Still, for Ryan's sake, I made an effort, bringing homemade desserts to family dinners and listening attentively to Harold's repetitive stories about his glory days as a high school basketball coach. Valerie, on the other hand, made no effort to hide her resentment toward me. In her eyes, I had committed the unforgivable sin of capturing her brother's attention she had monopolized her entire life. Every family gathering became a subtle battlefield, with Valerie creating small emergencies that required Ryan's immediate assistance, or making thinly veiled comments about how some people prioritized material possessions over spiritual growth. I weathered these storms with as much grace as I could muster, reminding myself that family relationships were important to Ryan and that maintaining peace was worth the occasional discomfort. That last normal day, before everything imploded, had been unremarkable in its ordinariness. I woke early, as was my habit, and spent an hour in the garage waxing the Mustang's flawless paint. Ryan had already left for work. He had an early marketing meeting and had kissed me goodbye while I was still half asleep. The autumn sun filtered through the garage windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor as I worked. There was something meditative about the circular motion of applying wax, the satisfaction of buffing it to a mirror shine. I lost myself in the process, my mind quieting for the first time in weeks. Work had been particularly stressful lately. Our engineering firm had taken on a major contract with tight deadlines, and as project lead, I'd been putting in 60-hour weeks. The time with my car was precious, stolen moments of peace in an otherwise chaotic schedule. I was just finishing when my phone buzzed on the workbench. Diane's name flashed on the screen, an unusual occurrence at 7:30 in the morning. My mother-in-law typically didn't call before noon, claiming that mornings were for family only, a category that apparently didn't include daughters-in-law. I hesitated before answering, a subtle uneasiness settling in my stomach. Something about the timing felt wrong. "Hello?" I answered, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Natalie." Diane's voice was clipped, formal in a way that immediately set me on edge. "I need to speak with you about something important. It's about the car." And with those words, the carefully constructed normalcy of my life began to crumble. "What do you mean, about the car?" I asked, gripping my phone tighter. There was a pause, a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "I think this is a conversation we should have in person," Diane said, her voice taking on that saccharine tone she used when delivering bad news. "Harold and I are actually on our way to your house now. We should be there in about 20 minutes. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. I looked at my Mustang, sunlight dancing across its polished surface. "Diane, I have to be at work in an hour. What's going on?" "Ryan didn't tell you?" The surprise in her voice seemed genuine, but with Diane it was hard to tell. She'd perfected the art of emotional manipulation long before I entered the family. "Oh dear, I assumed." "Well, never mind. We'll be there soon." She hung up before I could press for more information. I stood in my garage, phone in hand, staring at the car that represented not just 5 years of work, but a connection to my father that couldn't be replaced. What hadn't Ryan told me? I tried calling him immediately, but his phone went straight to voicemail. "Hey, this is Ryan. Leave a message." I didn't bother. Whatever was happening, I'd find out soon enough. I considered changing out of my oil-stained jeans and t-shirt before my in-laws arrived, but decided against it. If they were showing up unannounced on a Tuesday morning, they'd get me exactly as I was, grease under my fingernails and all. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Their silver Mercedes pulled into our driveway precisely 17 minutes later. Harold at the wheel, Diane beside him, both wearing expressions of grim determination that sent my anxiety levels soaring. I met them in the driveway, arms crossed, over my chest. "Natalie." Harold nodded, his usual bombastic greeting replaced by something resembling caution. "Beautiful day." "What's going on with my car?" I asked, skipping the pleasantries. Years of dealing with my in-laws had taught me that direct questions were my only defense against their meandering approach to difficult conversations. Diane adjusted her cashmere scarf, looking everywhere but at me. "Perhaps we should go inside. This isn't a driveway conversation." "This is exactly a driveway conversation if it involves my Mustang," I countered, planting my feet firmly on the concrete. Harold sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "The thing is, Natalie, the car isn't exactly yours anymore. Not legally, at least." The world seemed to tilt beneath me. "Excuse me?" "Ryan signed the title over to us last week," Harold continued, his tone matter of fact, as if he were discussing the weather rather than theft. "It's all perfectly legal. The car was in both your names, and a spouse has the right to sell joint property." "That's impossible," I said, my voice hollow even to my own ears. "We specifically put the car in my name only. I have the title in my safe." Diane finally met my gaze, her eyes sharp with triumph, poorly disguised as sympathy. "Actually, dear, Ryan had the title changed to joint ownership 3 months ago. He said you'd agreed it made more sense for insurance purposes." Memory flashed, Ryan with a stack of papers, catching me as I rushed out the door to work. "Just some insurance updates," he'd said. "Nothing important, but they need your signature." I'd signed without reading, trusting my husband because that's what partners do. "Where is my car?" I demanded, looking past them as if the Mustang might suddenly vanish from behind me. "It's been sold," Harold stated bluntly. "The transaction was completed yesterday. The new owner is picking it up today." My knees nearly buckled. "Sold? To whom? For how much?" Diane stepped forward, reaching for my arm. I jerked away from her touch. "Natalie, you have to understand. Valerie needed help. She's found this amazing healing center in Arizona that can finally address her emotional trauma, but the program costs. You sold my car to pay for another one of Valerie's spiritual adventures?" The words tasted like acid in my mouth. "My car, the one I spent 5 years restoring, the one that connects me to my dead father." That car? Harold's face hardened. Now, that's not fair. Valerie has legitimate needs. This program has a proven track record of helping people with her sensitivities. How much? I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. They exchanged glances. 48,000, Harold finally admitted. I let out a laugh that sounded more like a sob. The car was worth nearly twice that amount. You undersold it by at least $40,000. The buyer was a friend of mine from the golf club, Harold explained, as if that justified the theft and the below-market sale. He gave us cash, which was what we needed for Valerie's program. The payment was due immediately or she'd lose her spot. Where is Ryan? I asked, suddenly aware that my husband was conspicuously absent from this confrontation. Diane's perfectly manicured hand fluttered to her throat. He thought it would be better if we explained the situation. He felt you might overreact. Overreact? The word hung between us. You steal my car, my most valuable possession, to fund Valerie's latest whim, and you're worried I might overreact. It wasn't stealing, Harold insisted, his authoritative principal voice emerging. Ryan had every legal right. Stop talking. I held up my hand, a gesture that silenced him more effectively than I expected. When is this buyer coming to pick up my car? Diane glanced at her watch. Around noon. Mr. Peterson is sending his son with a trailer. 4 hours. I had 4 hours to figure out how to stop this. I want you to leave, I said quietly. Now. Natalie, be reasonable, Diane started. This is a family matter. It stopped being a family matter when you decided to take something that didn't belong to you. I cut her off. Leave my property before I call the police and report my car stolen. Harold puffed up indignantly. You wouldn't dare. Think what that would do to Ryan. What Ryan did to me? I corrected. Leave. Now. Something in my voice must have convinced them I was serious. They retreated to their Mercedes, Diane casting worried glances over her shoulder. As they backed out of the driveway, I stood motionless, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. I walked back to the garage in a daze, running my hand along the Mustang's hood. 5 years of weekends and evenings, thousands of hours. Researching, sourcing parts, learning new skills. Every dollar I could spare poured into this car because it was more than transportation. It was my connection to my father, a tangible reminder of his patience and love. And Ryan had signed it away for his sister's latest self-help scheme. My shock gave way to a focused fury as I pulled out my phone and called Brandon, a lawyer friend from college who specialized in property disputes. They can't just take it, I insisted after explaining the situation. I would never have agreed to joint ownership if I'd known what he was planning. Brandon's voice was gentle but firm. If you signed the papers changing the title to joint ownership, it's legally his. Property as much as yours. A spouse can sell jointly owned property without the other's consent in this state. I'm sorry, Nat. There has to be something I can do, I pressed, desperation creeping into my voice. You could try to prove fraud or coercion, but that's a long legal battle with no guarantee of success, Brandon explained. Your best bet might be to confront Ryan and try to stop the sale before the car changes hands. I thanked him and hung up, staring at my phone. The betrayal went beyond the car itself. Ryan knew what this Mustang meant to me. He'd watched me pour my heart and soul into its restoration. He'd held me on the anniversary of my father's death, when I'd wept in the garage, hands covered in grease, telling stories about the man who'd taught me everything I knew about cars. And still, he'd signed it away as if it were nothing more than metal and rubber, not the physical embodiment of my most precious memories. I called Ryan's office, bypassing his cell phone that continued to go straight to voicemail. Carson and Mills Brewing, how may I direct your call? The receptionist's cheerful voice grated on my raw nerves. This is Natalie Carson. I need to speak with my husband, Ryan, immediately. It's an emergency. I'm sorry, Mrs. Carson, but Ryan called in sick today. He's not in the office. The lie hit me like a physical blow. Ryan wasn't sick. He was hiding, avoiding the confrontation he knew was coming. I thanked the receptionist and ended the call, my mind racing. If Ryan wasn't at work, where was he? And more importantly, how could I stop the sale of my car before noon? I sank onto the garage stool, surrounded by the tools my father had left me, and forced myself to think clearly. Emotion wouldn't help me now. I needed a plan. I opened my laptop and navigated to our joint bank account, where another shock awaited me. The balance, which should have contained nearly $15,000, was down to just over $800. A withdrawal for $14,200 had been made the previous day, with the description, "Family Medical Emergency." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Not only had they taken my car, but they'd drained our savings as well. All for Valerie's healing. A text message alert chimed on my phone. It was from an unknown number. "This is Jack Peterson. My dad bought a '67 Mustang from Harold Weber. I'll be by around noon to pick it up with a trailer. The address I have is 4521 Maple Lane. Is that correct?" My fingers hovered over the keyboard. This stranger had no idea he was walking into a family war zone. For a moment, I considered telling him the whole sordid story. But what would that accomplish? If the sale was legal, as Brandon had indicated, there was nothing he could do. Instead, I typed, "This is Natalie, the owner of the Mustang. There's been a complication with the sale. Can we delay pickup until tomorrow? I need to sort some things out." His response came quickly. "Sorry, I'm driving in from Seattle, already on the road. Dad said everything was finalized. Is there a problem with the car?" "No problem with the car," I replied. "Just a misunderstanding about the timing. Could you call me when you're about 30 minutes away? I want to make sure I'm home." "Will do," he responded. I set my phone down, a plan forming in my mind. I had until noon to find Ryan and confront him. If I couldn't stop the sale legally, maybe I could appeal to whatever shred of decency he still possessed. First, I needed to know where he was hiding. I tried Ryan's favorite haunts first, the craft brewery where he sometimes worked remotely, the coffee shop near his office, even the golf course where he occasionally met Harold for morning rounds. Nothing. His friends hadn't heard from him, and his assistant at work seemed genuinely confused by my questions. He called in sick, said, "He had a stomach bug," she insisted. "Is everything okay, Natalie?" "No," I admitted. "Everything is definitely not okay." As a last resort, I drove to Harold and Diane's house. Ryan had grown up in the sprawling Tudor-style home, and it remained his safe harbor whenever life became too complicated. The same could not be said for me. The Weber household had always felt like hostile territory. Sure enough, Ryan's Audi was parked in his parents' driveway, partially hidden behind Diane's rose bushes as if he'd tried to conceal it from street view. Coward. I parked directly behind his car, blocking any potential escape, and marched to the front door. My hand hovered over the doorbell for just a moment before I decided against announcing my arrival. The element of surprise might be my only advantage. I used my key, given to me years ago for emergencies, and entered quietly. Voices drifted from the kitchen, tense and hushed. I recognized Ryan's immediately, along with Valerie's distinctive whine and Diane's soothing murmurs. "She's going to hate me forever," Ryan was saying, his voice strained. "You don't understand what this car meant to her." "She's being materialistic," Valerie snapped. "It's just a car. My mental health is at stake here. This retreat is my last chance to heal from my trauma." I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, taking in the scene. Ryan slouched at the breakfast bar, head in his hands. Valerie paced the Spanish tile floor, gesticulating wildly as she spoke. Diane stood at the stove, preparing what smelled like her signature comfort food, chicken noodle soup, as if this were a simple case of hurt feelings rather than profound betrayal. "What trauma would that be exactly, Valerie?" I asked coldly. All three heads whipped toward me, faces registering shock at my sudden appearance. "The trauma of always getting exactly what you want?" Ryan stood up so quickly he knocked over his bar stool. "Natalie, I can explain." "Explain what? How you forged my signature to change the title to my car? How you sold it without my knowledge? How you emptied our savings account?" Each question felt like a bullet fired from a gun. "I didn't forge anything," he protested weakly. "You signed the papers." "Under false pretenses," I countered. "You told me they were insurance documents." Diane stepped forward, wooden spoon in hand like a scepter. "Natalie, please lower your voice. This is a family matter that can be resolved calmly." "This stopped being a family matter when you decided to steal from me," I said, not taking my eyes off Ryan. "Why? Just tell me why you would do this." Ryan looked at his mother, then his sister, clearly hoping for intervention. When none came, he sighed. "Val needs this retreat. Her therapist said it's the only program that can address her specific needs." They had a last-minute opening, but the payment was due immediately, and we didn't have enough savings to cover it. "So you sold my car? The one thing you knew meant everything to me?" I could barely force the words past the knot in my throat. "It wasn't just the retreat," Ryan admitted, staring at the floor. "Valerie has some other debts that needed clearing up before she could go. Credit cards, mostly. And there was a loan from her ex-boyfriend that he was threatening legal action over." I turned to Valerie, who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "How much?" She shrugged, examining her manicured nails. "About 30,000. Plus 18,000 for the retreat," Ryan added. "The car sale covered everything, with a little left over for spending money while she's there." The casual way they discussed liquidating my most precious possession made my blood boil. "And it never occurred to any of you to discuss this with me first? To ask if I was willing to sell my car to bail out Valerie? Again?" "You would have said no," Valerie stated matter-of-factly. "You're damn right I would have said no. That car was my connection to my father. It was irreplaceable to me." "See? This is exactly why we couldn't tell you," Diane interjected. "You're too emotional about a pile of metal and too selfish to consider Valerie's needs." I laughed bitterly. "Selfish? That's rich coming from the woman who's raised her daughter to believe the world revolves around her problems. How many times have we bailed Valerie out, Ryan? How many programs and retreats and healing journeys have we funded over the years?" Ryan had the grace to look ashamed. "This one is different. The doctor said—" "I don't care what some quack doctor said," I exploded. "This isn't about Valerie's mental health. It's about all of you using me as your personal ATM. Well, I'm done. The bank is closed." My phone chimed with a text message. It was Jack Peterson. "About 30 minutes away. From your address. See you soon." The countdown was real now. In 30 minutes, my car would be gone forever unless I did something drastic. I faced Ryan, feeling strangely calm despite the storm raging inside me. "You have two choices. Either you call Harold right now and tell him to cancel the sale and return the money, or I'm going to the police to report the car as stolen." Valerie gasped. "You wouldn't." "Try me," I challenged, fixing her with a stare that made her take a step back. Ryan shook his head. "Nat, you can't. The sale is legal. I had the right to sell it." "Maybe," I conceded. "But I can still file a report claiming you obtained the title change fraudulently by misrepresenting the documents I signed. It might not stick, but it will certainly delay things long enough for a full investigation." "How do you think that will affect your job, Ryan? The marketing director for Carson and Mills Brewing caught in a fraud investigation? You're bluffing, Diane said, but uncertainty tinged her voice. Call Harold, I insisted, pushing my phone toward Ryan. Now. Ryan hesitated, looking from me to his mother to his sister. I could see the calculation in his eyes, weighing his options, trying to determine if I was serious. Even if we wanted to stop the sale, it's too late, Valerie interjected. The money's been paid. I've already put down the non-refundable deposit for the retreat. If I don't go, that money is just gone. That's not my problem, I replied coldly. It kind of is, Ryan argued weakly. That was our savings, too. Our savings that you cleaned out without asking me, I reminded him. Do you understand what you've done, Ryan? This isn't just about the car or the money. You betrayed my trust in the most fundamental way possible. You knew exactly what that car meant to me, and you sold it anyway. I didn't have a choice, he protested. Val needed... Stop saying that. I slammed my hand down on the counter, making all three of them jump. Valerie doesn't need another expensive retreat. She needs to grow up and take responsibility for her life instead of expecting her family to finance her endless journey of self-discovery. Valerie's face crumpled. Right on cue, the tears began to flow. You've always hated me, she sobbed, looking to her mother for support. You've never understood what it's like to be sensitive, to feel things so deeply. Diane immediately wrapped an arm around her daughter. Shh, it's okay, sweetheart. Natalie doesn't understand what you've been through. I watched the familiar performance with detachment. How many times had I seen this exact scene play out? Valerie cries. Everyone rushes to comfort her, and the actual issue gets buried beneath a landslide of emotion. I'm not doing this, I said firmly. Ryan, last chance. Call your father and tell him to stop the sale, or I'm going to the police. Ryan looked panicked. Nat, please. You know Dad won't back down once he's made a deal. His reputation at the Cuff is more important than your marriage, than my trust, than the one thing I had left of my father. I filled in the blank he couldn't bring himself to complete. The silence that followed was answer enough. In that moment, I saw our relationship with perfect clarity. I had never been Ryan's priority. His loyalty had always been to his family of origin, not to the family we had built together. I see, I said quietly. Then I have a choice to make too. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, ignoring the calls of my name behind me. In the entry hall, I paused at the small table where Diane displayed family photos. There was one of Ryan and me on our wedding day, looking young and hopeful. I studied it for a moment, remembering how I'd believed we were building something unbreakable. What a fool I'd been. Back in my car, I faced three impossible options. I could go to the police knowing that even if they took my report, the legal battle would be long and uncertain. I could try to intercept Jack Peterson and explain the situation, hoping to appeal to his humanity. Or I could simply accept the loss of my car, my savings, and my marriage, and figure out how to move forward. None of these choices would bring back what I'd lost. None would repair the trust that had been shattered. I was caught in a no-win scenario created by the people who were supposed to love me most. As I sat in my car, watching the minutes tick by on the dashboard clock, I realized that the real choice wasn't about the Mustang at all. It was about what kind of life I wanted for myself going forward. Would I continue to be the family resource, expected to sacrifice my needs and wants for Valerie's latest crisis? Or would I finally set boundaries that protected what was precious to me? The decision crystallized with surprising clarity. I started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, leaving Ryan's car still blocked in. He could figure out his own transportation for once. I had a car to save and a future to reclaim. I drove home with a singular focus, my mind racing ahead to formulate a plan. The digital clock on my dashboard showed 11:17 a.m., less than 45 minutes until Jack Peterson would arrive to take away my Mustang. Not much time to mount a defense, but I'd be damned if I'd make it easy for them. As I pulled into my driveway, I spotted a familiar figure sitting on my front porch. Harold Weber, looking every inch the disgruntled patriarch, rose to his feet as I approached. "I've been waiting for you," he announced, as if I should be honored by his presence. "Diane called, said you were making threats." I brushed past him, keys in hand. Not threats, promises. He followed me to the front door, his golf shoes clicking irritatingly against the concrete. "Natalie, I understand you're upset, but this hostility is unnecessary. The car has been sold. The money has been dispersed. There's nothing to be gained by creating a scene." I turned to face him, key poised at the lock. "Did Ryan tell you?" How he changed the title. How he lied to me about what I was signing. A flicker of discomfort crossed Harold's face before his expression hardened again. "That's between you and Ryan. The point is, the sale is legal and binding. My friend Peterson has paid cash. His son is on the way to collect the vehicle." "Your friend severely underpaid," I pointed out. "That car is worth nearly twice what you sold it for." Harold waved a dismissive hand. "Peterson is doing me a favor, taking it off our hands quickly. Besides, it's just a car. Certainly not worth destroying your marriage over." I laughed, the sound sharp even to my own ears. That's rich, coming from the man who helped orchestrate the whole thing. "Tell me, Harold, was this your idea from the start? Did you suggest to Ryan that my car could solve Valerie's financial problems?" His silence was damning. "That's what I thought," I said, pushing open my front door. "You've never respected my boundaries. None of you have." "Now wait just a minute," Harold protested, following me uninvited into my home. "This family has done nothing but support you. We welcomed you with open arms. We've included you in every holiday, every celebration." While simultaneously undermining my marriage, dismissing my career, and treating me like an outsider, I finished for him. "Let's not pretend this is the first time the Weber family has decided my needs were less important than Valerie's whims." Harold's face flushed an unhealthy shade of red. "Valerie has special requirements. She's sensitive in ways you can't understand. This retreat is critical for her healing process." "What exactly is she healing from, Harold?" I demanded, dropping my purse on the entryway table. "Because from where I stand, Valerie has led a life of extraordinary privilege, with parents who've cleared every obstacle from her path and made excuses for every failure." "You have no right," he began, but I cut him off. "I have every right. This is my home, that is my car, and I am done being the family ATM." I pointed to the door. "Now get out. When Jack Peterson arrives, I'll deal with him myself." Harold didn't budge. "I can't allow that. Peterson is a respected member of my golf club. I gave him my word that this transaction would go smoothly." He squared his shoulders, using his height to try to intimidate me. "I'll be staying until the car is safely loaded and on its way." "Fine," I conceded, surprising him. "Stay if you want, but you should know that I've already called my lawyer. He's drawing up papers as we speak, documenting the fraudulent way in which Ryan obtained my signature on the title change." This was a bluff. Brandon had offered advice but wasn't actively working on my case, but Harold didn't need to know that. "You're making a terrible mistake," Harold warned, his voice dropping to a threatening growl. "If you pursue this legally, you're not just taking on Ryan. You're taking on this entire family. We have resources you can't imagine." "Is that a threat?" "It's a reality check. The Webers have been in this community for 4 generations. We sit on boards. We know judges. We have influence." He leaned closer. "Do you really want to discover what happens when you make enemies of us?" The old Natalie might have been intimidated by this display of Weber family power. The old Natalie might have backed down, swallowed her pride, and found a way to make peace at her own expense. But I wasn't that woman anymore. "Get out of my house, Harold," I said quietly. "You can wait in your car until Peterson arrives." "I'm not going anywhere," he insisted, planting himself firmly in my living room. "Then I'll call the police and have you removed for trespassing," I countered, pulling out my phone. "Your choice." He assessed my expression, searching for any sign of weakness or hesitation. Finding none, he relented, but not without a parting shot. "Ryan was right about you. Beneath that professional veneer, you're just a stubborn, ungrateful girl who never understood what it means to be part of this family." The words were designed to wound, to make me question myself. 6 months ago, they might have succeeded, but now they only strengthened my resolve. If being part of your family means sacrificing everything I value, then I want no part of it, I replied, holding the door open pointedly. Harold stalked out, muttering about ingratitude and disrespect. I closed the door behind him, leaning against it for a moment to collect my thoughts. Through the window, I could see him pacing beside his BMW, phone pressed to his ear. No doubt reporting to Diane, or perhaps calling in reinforcements. I didn't have much time. Jack Peterson would arrive soon, and I needed a strategy. I couldn't legally prevent him from taking the car, not without a court order, which I had no time to obtain. But perhaps I could appeal to his sense of fairness, human to human. I hurried to my office and powered up my computer. If I was going to convince Peterson's son that something shady had happened, I'd need evidence. I printed out bank statements showing the sudden withdrawal of our savings, photos of me working on the Mustang over the years, and the original purchase documentation in my name alone. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Jack Peterson again. GPS says I'm about 15 minutes from your address. Still okay to pick up the car?" I typed back, "Yes, but there's a situation you should be aware of when you arrive. The sale of this car involves some complications." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then reappeared. Finally. "What kind of complications? My dad said everything was finalized." "Legal complications," I replied. "I'll explain when you get here." No response followed. I gathered my printed documents into a folder and went to the garage for one last moment with my car. The Mustang gleamed under the garage. Lights, perfect in every detail from the custom leather interior to the meticulously restored engine. I ran my hand along its flank, remembering the countless hours my father and I had spent discussing the finer points of muscle car restoration. "I tried, Dad," I whispered, fighting back tears. "I really did." The sound of tires on gravel pulled me from my reverie. I stepped out of the garage to see a white truck pulling a car trailer turning into my driveway. Harold immediately approached the vehicle, intercepting the driver before he could even step out. I moved quickly down the driveway, determined to get to Jack Peterson before Harold could poison the well. As I approached, a young man in his late 20s emerged from the truck. He looked nothing like I'd imagined, not the entitled son of a wealthy golf club member, but a working-class guy in faded jeans and a Seattle Seahawks cap. "Jack Peterson?" I asked, extending my hand before Harold could introduce himself. He nodded, looking confused by the tension evident in our body language. "That's me. You must be Natalie? And you are." He turned to Harold. "Harold Weber, the seller," he said firmly. "My son-in-law handled the transaction with your father." "Actually," I interjected, "I'm the owner of the car, or at least, I was until very recently." Jack looked between us, clearly sensing he'd stepped into the middle of something messy. "Look, I don't want any trouble. Dad just sent me to pick up a car he bought." "And you will," Harold assured him. "Natalie is just having some seller's remorse, that's all. The sale is completely legitimate. The car was sold without my knowledge. Or consent," I countered, fixing Jack with a direct gaze. My husband changed the title behind my back and sold my most prized possession to fund his sister's spiritual retreat. Jack shifted uncomfortably. That sounds like a family issue you need to work out. I'm just here to transport the car. I understand that, I said, handing him the folder of documents. But I thought you should know exactly what you're participating in. That Mustang represents 5 years of my life and a connection to my late father. It's worth far more than what your father paid for it. Harold stepped between us. This is inappropriate, Natalie. Mr. Peterson doesn't need to be dragged into our personal matters. Jack glanced at the folder in his hands, then back at me. Ma'am, I sympathize. I really do. But my dad made a deal. I'm just doing what he asked. Of course, I said, nodding. Just like Ryan did what his father asked. The Weber men are good at following orders, aren't they, Harold? Harold's face darkened with anger. That's quite enough. Mr. Peterson, if you'll follow me to the garage, we can complete this transaction without further drama. Jack hesitated, glancing at the folder again. Dad didn't tell me there was a dispute about the car. There is no dispute, Harold insisted. The title has been transferred legally. The money has been paid. End of story. My phone buzzed again. A text from Ryan. Dad says you're harassing the buyer's son. Stop making this worse than it already is. I showed the message to Jack. See what I'm dealing with? They're all in it together. A thoughtful frown crossed Jack's features. He opened the folder and quickly scanned the first few documents. You restored this car yourself? Every bolt and bracket, I confirmed. It was a project my father and I planned to do together, but he passed away before we could start. I finished it in his memory. Jack's expression softened slightly. My granddad and I rebuilt a '72 Chevelle when I was in high school. Still got it. Would never sell it for anything. A spark of hope flared in my chest. Perhaps I'd found an ally after all. Look, Jack said, lowering his voice. I'm just the delivery guy here. I can't undo a sale my father made, but... He glanced at his watch. I've got a long drive back to Seattle. Might take me a while to get the trailer positioned just right. Paperwork to check over. Could easily be an hour before I'm ready to load up. He handed the folder back to me with a meaningful look. Might give you time to make some calls. See if there's anything that can be done through official channels. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small window of opportunity. I appreciate that, I said quietly. Harold, who had been watching our exchange with growing suspicion, stepped forward. There's no need for delay. The garage is right there. The car is ready to go. Jack turned to him with a professional smile. No offense, sir, but I've been doing this a long time. Gotta make sure everything's by the book. Car like that, you can't be too careful with the loading process. Wouldn't want any damage to occur during transport. Harold looked like he wanted to argue but thought better of it. Fine, but I'll be staying to ensure everything proceeds as agreed. Suit yourself, Jack shrugged, heading back to his truck. To begin the elaborate process of positioning his trailer, I retreated to the house, mind racing. 1 hour wasn't much time, but it was better than nothing. The question was, what could I possibly accomplish in such a short window that would stop the sale of my car? As I closed the front door behind me, a plan began to form. Desperate, possibly futile, but the only option I had left. I picked up my phone and made 2 calls in quick succession, one to my bank and one to Brandon. Then I opened my laptop and navigated to a website I'd never thought I'd need. Time to fight fire with fire. My first call was to our bank. After navigating the automated system and verifying my identity, I was connected to a personal banker, named Michelle. I need to know if there's any way to place a hold on a withdrawal that was made yesterday, I explained, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. That depends on several factors, Michelle replied. Was the withdrawal made from a joint account? Yes, but it was made without my knowledge or consent, I said. My husband withdrew almost our entire savings. I understand your concern, Michelle said carefully. However, with joint accounts, both parties have equal access and authorization. Unless you can prove fraud, like someone other than your husband accessing the account, there's little we can do after the fact. Even if he used the money for something that benefits his family but harms mine? I pressed. I'm sorry, Mrs. Carson. The bank doesn't arbitrate domestic disputes. If you're concerned about future withdrawals, I can help you set up a separate account in your name only. I thanked her and ended the call, disappointed but not surprised. The banking system was designed to protect against external fraud, not the intimate betrayal of a spouse. My call to Brandon went slightly better. I spoke with a colleague who specializes in marital property disputes, he told me. There might be a way to challenge the vehicle sale based on bad faith dealings, but it would require filing for an emergency injunction. How quickly can we do that? I asked, glancing at the window where I could see Harold supervising Jack's painfully slow process of positioning the trailer. Realistically, not today, Brandon admitted. Even with an emergency filing, it would take at least 24 to 48 hours to get before a judge. The car will be gone in an hour, I said, deflating. I'm sorry, Nat. The law moves slowly, even in emergencies. He paused. Have you considered a different approach? Sometimes a direct conversation with the buyer can be more effective than legal maneuvers. Harold intercepted him before I could really explain, I said. And even if the son sympathizes, the father already paid for the car. He's not going to just walk away from the deal. Maybe not, Brandon conceded, but people can surprise you, especially when they realize they're participating in something potentially unethical. After hanging up, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the folder of documents I'd prepared. Brandon was right. My only real hope was to convince Peterson Sr. to voluntarily back out of the deal. But how could I reach him when Harold was standing guard outside? My laptop chimed with an incoming email. It was from the website I'd visited earlier, a car collectors forum where enthusiasts bought, sold, and discussed classic vehicles. I'd created an account and posted an urgent message describing my situation and the 1967 Mustang Fastback that was about to be taken from me. The email contained responses to my post, most expressing sympathy but offering little practical help. One response, however, caught my attention. That car sounds familiar. Green 67 Fastback with restored original. Interior and rebuilt 390 V8? If it's the one I'm thinking of, Robert Peterson from Seattle just bragged about buying it for a steal at $48K. He posted in the P&W Classic Mustang group yesterday, said he's planning to flip it at Barrett-Jackson next month for double what he paid. If that's your car, you should know the buyer's intentions. I stared at the screen, a new understanding dawning. This wasn't just a casual purchase by a car enthusiast. It was a calculated business move. Peterson had recognized the value of my Mustang and jumped at the chance to buy it at well below market price, planning to resell it for significant profit. The knowledge burned like acid in my stomach. Not only had my family betrayed me, but they'd been played by Peterson, who recognized they were desperate for quick cash and took advantage of their ignorance about the car's true worth. Another email arrived, this one containing a link to Peterson's post in the Pacific Northwest Classic Mustang group. There it was in black and white, Robert Peterson boasting about the deal he'd secured through a golf buddy whose son-in-law needed to liquidate assets quickly. He included photos Harold had sent him, photos of my car, my restoration work, and a detailed description of how he planned to make a tidy profit at the upcoming Barrett-Jackson auction in Scottsdale. Snagged this beauty for $48K, should clear at least $90K at auction. Some people don't know what they have. The smug satisfaction in his words made my blood boil. I printed the post, adding it to my folder of evidence. Jack Peterson might be sympathetic to my plight, but his father was nothing but an opportunist, profiting from my family's betrayal. As I stared at the printout, another realization struck me. Peterson's post mentioned that his son would be bringing the car to his workshop in Seattle for detailing before the auction. If the car was headed to a commercial location rather than a private residence, that might change things legally. I quickly called Brandon back. If the buyer is purchasing the car as a business investment rather than for personal use, does that change anything? I asked without preamble. Potentially, Brandon replied, sounding intrigued. If we can prove the buyer knew there was a dispute about ownership and still proceeded with a commercial purpose in mind, it could strengthen a claim of bad faith dealing. Do you have evidence of commercial intent? I just found the buyer bragging online about how he plans to flip the car at auction next month for double what he paid, I said. He specifically mentioned that he knew it was undervalued. That's helpful, Brandon confirmed. It doesn't change the immediate situation. We still can't get an injunction in time, but it strengthens your case for the title being transferred through fraudulent means. I thanked him and hung up, mind racing. Even with this new information, I couldn't stop the car from leaving today, but maybe I could build a strong enough case to reclaim it later, or at least secure proper compensation. The sound of voices outside drew me to the window. Jack was engaged in what appeared to be a heated phone conversation, while Harold hovered nearby, his body language tense and defensive. I couldn't hear their words, but Jack's expression suggested he was receiving information that troubled him. I gathered my expanded folder of evidence and stepped outside, approaching cautiously. "Everything okay?" I asked Jack, who was pocketing his phone with a frown. He glanced at Harold, then back to me. "Just got off the phone with my dad. He wants me to hurry things along." "Understandable," Harold interjected smoothly. "It's a long drive back to Seattle." "Actually," Jack said, "it sounds like he's in quite a rush to get this car in his workshop." "Something about prepping it for an auction next month?" Harold's expression flickered with surprise. "I'm sure I don't know anything about that. Robert simply said he was an admirer of classic Mustangs." "Is that so?" I said, holding out the printout of Peterson's forum post. "Because, according to this, he's planning to flip the car at Barrett-Jackson for nearly double what he paid. He explicitly mentions his golf buddy helping him secure an undervalued asset." Harold snatched the paper from my hand, eyes scanning the text rapidly. His face reddened as he read. This is taken out of context. Robert would never— "Save it, Harold," I cut him off. "Peterson played you just like you played me. The only difference is I actually care about that car, while you were all too happy to let it go for pennies on the dollar to solve Valerie's latest crisis." Jack looked between us, his discomfort evident. "Look, I'm just here to transport the vehicle. Whatever arrangements my father made with Mr. Weber aren't my business." "That's where you're wrong," I said, turning to face him directly. "When you knowingly transport property obtained through deception, it becomes your business, especially when that property is destined for commercial resale." Jack shifted uncomfortably. "Like I said before, I sympathize with your situation, but I have a job to do." "Let me ask you something," I pressed. "If someone sold your grandfather's Chevelle without your knowledge while you were at work, how would you feel? What would you do?" The question hit home. Jack's expression softened momentarily before he schooled it back to professional neutrality. "I'd be upset," he admitted. "But, Jack," Harold interrupted sharply, "Mrs. Carson is attempting to manipulate you emotionally. The facts remain unchanged. The car has been legally sold. Your father has paid for it. Your only responsibility is to transport it safely to Seattle." Jack nodded slowly. "You're right, sir, and that's why I need to be methodical about this process." He gestured to the trailer, which was still not quite aligned with the garage. "Safety first." Harold checked his watch impatiently. "How much longer?" "Hard to say," Jack replied, maddeningly vague. "These old cars require special handling. Could be another 30 minutes, maybe more." Harold's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and stepped away to answer, his voice low but agitated. I seized the opportunity to speak privately with Jack. "Your father is planning to sell my car for profit," I said quickly. "A car he knows was obtained through deception. That makes him complicit in fraud." Jack ran a hand through his hair. "Mrs. Carson, I understand you're upset." "This isn't about being upset," I interrupted. "This is about right and wrong. Your father is an experienced car collector. He knew exactly what he was doing when he offered half the market value for a fully restored classic Mustang. He took advantage of a situation where my husband betrayed me, and now he stands to profit handsomely from that betrayal." Jack's expression remained carefully neutral, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" It was a fair question. What did I expect from this young man caught between professional obligation and moral discomfort? "Call your father again," I suggested. "Tell him what's really happening here. Tell him that the car's true owner is fighting to keep it, that it has personal significance beyond its monetary value. Ask him if making a profit is worth participating in this kind of family destruction." Jack glanced over at Harold, who was still engaged in his phone call, gesturing emphatically. "And if he still wants the car?" "Then at least he'll be making a fully informed decision," I said. "He'll know exactly what kind of transaction he's involved in." Jack considered this for a long moment. "I'll call him," he finally agreed. "But I can't promise anything." "That's all I'm asking," I said, relief washing through me. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small crack in the seemingly impenetrable wall of opposition I'd been facing. As Jack moved away to make the call, Harold returned, his expression thunderous. "That was Ryan," he informed me. "He's on his way here now. Says you're not answering his texts." I pulled out my phone to find 7 unread messages from Ryan, ranging from apologetic to angry to threatening. I'd been so focused on saving my car that I'd tuned out his digital pleas. "Good," I said, pocketing the phone without responding to the texts. "It's about time he showed up to face what he's done." Harold stepped closer, lowering his voice. "This vendetta of yours is getting out of hand, Natalie. You're making a scene, embarrassing the family, and for what? A car? Is that really worth destroying your marriage?" The audacity of his question left me momentarily speechless. When I found my voice again, it was steady and clear. My marriage was destroyed the moment Ryan decided his sister's spiritual journey was more important than my trust. The moment he chose to lie to me, steal from me, and then hide from the consequences. I met Harold's gaze unflinchingly. This isn't about a car. It's about respect, honesty, and basic human decency, qualities your family seems to reserve exclusively for Valerie. Harold's face hardened. "You've never understood our family dynamics. Valerie needs—" "I understand perfectly," I cut him off. "Valerie needs, Valerie takes, and everyone else pays the price. Well, I'm done paying. Whatever happens with this car today, you should know that I'm finished being the Weber family ATM." The sound of tires on gravel announced another arrival. Ryan's Audi pulled into the driveway, parking haphazardly behind Jack's truck. The driver's door flew open, and Ryan emerged, looking harried and distressed. Harold immediately moved to intercept his son, conferring in hushed tones while casting glances in my direction. Their body language spoke volumes, the older man giving instructions, the younger nodding dutifully. I turned back to see Jack approaching, his expression unreadable. "I spoke with my father," he said quietly. "And?" I prompted, heart hammering in my chest. "He's considering his options," Jack replied carefully. "He asked me to verify the car's condition while he thinks it over." It wasn't much, but it was more than I'd dared hope for. A small reprieve, a tiny opening in what had seemed like an airtight case against me. Ryan broke away from his father and approached us, his expression a mixture of anger and apprehension. Nat? What are you doing? Dad says you're harassing Mr. Peterson's son and threatening legal action. I looked at my husband, this man I'd trusted with my life, my heart, my future, and felt nothing but cold determination. I'm fighting for what's mine, I replied. Something you should have done instead of selling me out. The lines were drawn, the battle joined. As Ryan opened his mouth to respond, I steeled myself for the confrontation to come. This was far from over. Ryan approached with the cautious body language of someone expecting an explosion. His eyes darted between me and Jack, assessing the I situation. Jack Peterson? He extended his hand. I'm Ryan Carson, the seller. I apologize for any confusion my wife might have caused. Jack shook his hand briefly. No problem, just doing my job. Ryan turned to me, lowering his voice. Can we talk privately for a minute? Anything you have to say can be said right here, I replied, crossing my arms. He sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Nat, please. This has gotten completely out of hand. You're making a scene and embarrassing everyone involved. I'm embarrassing everyone? I laughed incredulously. That's rich coming from the man who secretly changed the title on my car, sold it behind my back, and then hid at his parents' house rather than face me. Ryan winced at my words. I know you're angry and you have every right to be, but what's done is done. The car is sold. The money has been allocated. Creating all this drama isn't going to change anything. Drama? I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. Is that what you call fighting for something that matters to me? Something that connected me to my father? That's not fair, Ryan protested. I know the car was important to you, but Valerie's mental health is at stake here. This retreat program could be life-changing for her. Just like the yoga instructor certification in Bali was life-changing, or the crystal healing course in New Mexico, or the past life regression therapy in Colorado. I listed off Valerie's previous expensive callings that had fizzled out after a few weeks. When does it end, Ryan? When do you finally admit that your sister uses these spiritual journeys as a way to avoid real responsibility? You don't understand her struggles, Ryan said defensively. No, you don't understand mine, I shot back. You chose your sister over your wife. You stole something irreplaceable from me to fund her latest whim. That's not love or loyalty. It's betrayal in its purest form. Jack cleared his throat awkwardly. I'm going to check the alignment of the trailer again, he muttered, clearly uncomfortable with the marital dispute unfolding before him. As he walked away, Ryan stepped closer to me. I didn't want to do it this way, he said, his voice low and urgent. But Dad said it was the only option. Peterson needed an answer immediately, and we knew you'd never agree. So you decided to just take what was mine? I asked. Did you ever stop to think about what that car meant to me? About how it connected me to my father? A flash of genuine guilt crossed Ryan's face. Of course I did. That's why it was so hard to go through with it. But Val's situation is dire, Nat. Her therapist says this retreat is her last chance to address her trauma. What trauma, Ryan? I demanded. Valerie has lived a charmed life with parents who worship the ground she walks on. The only trauma she's experienced is occasionally being told no, something that clearly doesn't happen often enough. Ryan's expression hardened. That's cruel. You know she struggles with anxiety and depression. Many people do, I acknowledged. But most of them don't expect their families to fund endless spiritual quests at the expense of others. Harold approached, apparently tired of waiting. This isn't productive, he interjected. Mr. Peterson is waiting for confirmation that he can collect his vehicle. I suggest we proceed with the transfer and discuss family matters later. This isn't your house, Harold, I reminded him. You don't get to dictate how things proceed here. Jack returned, phone in hand. My father would like to speak with Mrs. Carson, he announced, holding out the device. All three of us stared at him in surprise. Me? I asked, reaching for the phone. Harold quickly stepped between us. That's unnecessary. I represented the seller in this transaction and— With all due respect, sir, Jack interrupted firmly. My father specifically asked to speak with Mrs. Carson. Harold looked like he wanted to snatch the phone away, but social propriety held him back. I took the device from Jack's outstretched hand, trying to keep my expression neutral despite the hope fluttering in my chest. Hello, this is Natalie. Carson, I said, moving a few steps away for privacy. Mrs. Carson, Robert Peterson here. The voice was gruff, but not unkind. My son has shared some concerning information about the circumstances surrounding the sale of this Mustang. Yes, Mr. Peterson. I've been trying to explain that the car was sold without my knowledge or consent. So I understand. He paused. I've been collecting and selling classic cars for over 30 years, Mrs. Carson. In my experience, clear titles and clean histories make for the best investments. Controversy and legal disputes do not. My heart sank. He was backing out of the deal, not because he sympathized with my situation, but because he feared potential complications with the resale. I see, I said, trying to keep the disappointment from my voice. That being said, Peterson continued, my son also tells me this car has sentimental value to you, that you restored it yourself as a tribute to your late father. Yes, I confirmed, surprised by this turn in the conversation. Every part of that car represents hours spent with my dad learning about restoration. After he passed, completing it was my way of honoring his memory. Peterson was quiet for a moment. I lost my own father 10 years ago, he finally said. Still have the '57 Thunderbird we restored together. Wouldn't sell it for any price. Hope flickered again. Then you understand. I do, he acknowledged. Which puts me in a difficult position. Legally, I've purchased this vehicle. The money has been transferred, paperwork signed, but morally. He trailed off. It was obtained through deception, I finished for him. So it seems. Another pause. Here's what I'm willing to do, Mrs. Carson. I'll agree to sell the car back to you, at my purchase price plus a 10% fee for my trouble. I did the quick math. That would be $52,800, nearly all the money Valerie had already earmarked for her retreat and debt payments. Money that was no longer in our accounts. Mr. Peterson, I appreciate that offer, but the money from the sale has already been dispersed. I don't have access to those funds. I see, he said, his tone cooling slightly. Well, that complicates matters. An idea struck me. What if I could pay you in installments? I have excellent credit, a stable job. I could make monthly payments until the full amount is restored. That's not how I typically do business, Peterson replied, skepticism evident in his voice. Please, I pressed. This isn't a typical situation. You'd still make your 10% profit, just over time, rather than immediately. Peterson sighed heavily. Let me speak with my son again. The line went silent as he placed me on hold. I glanced over to see Ryan and Harold watching me intently, clearly trying to decipher the conversation from my expressions. Jack stood apart, busying himself with the trailer hitch. After what felt like an eternity, Peterson returned. My son has made a compelling case on your behalf, Mrs. Carson. Against my better judgment, I'm willing to consider a payment arrangement. But I'd need significant collateral, and I'd want everything properly documented by lawyers. Relief washed over me. Of course. I completely understand. I'll have Jack bring the car back to my workshop in Seattle, Peterson continued. It will remain there as collateral until the debt is paid in full. You'll need to come up to sign the paperwork and establish the payment schedule. Say, this weekend? It wasn't ideal, The car would still leave today, and I'd have to take on substantial debt to reclaim it. But it was a lifeline, a chance to undo the damage Ryan and his family had caused. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson," I said sincerely. "I'll be there this weekend with my lawyer." "Very well. Put my son back on, please." I returned to the driveway where the three men waited, their expressions ranging from curiosity to apprehension. I handed the phone back to Jack, who stepped away to continue the conversation with his father privately. "What's happening?" Ryan demanded. "What did Peterson say?" I met his gaze steadily. "He's agreed to sell the car back to me." Harold's face darkened. "That's absurd. The deal is done. The money has been paid." "Apparently, Mr. Peterson has some ethical concerns about purchasing a vehicle that was essentially stolen from its rightful owner," I replied, watching Harold's face flush with anger. "Nothing was stolen," he insisted. "The sale was completely legal." "Legal doesn't always mean right, Harold," I said quietly. "Something your family seems to have forgotten." Ryan stepped forward, his expression a mixture of confusion and hope. "So what happens now? Does Peterson return the money?" "No," I shook my head. "I'll be paying him back in installments with interest. The car stays with him as collateral until it's paid off." Ryan's eyes widened. "But that's essentially buying the car twice." "No, Ryan. It's cleaning up the mess you made," I corrected him. "It's me sacrificing my financial security to reclaim something you should never have taken in the first place." Harold intervened, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when he expected immediate compliance. "This is unacceptable. Peterson can't back out now. I gave him my word as a gentleman that this deal was solid." "Perhaps you should have been more forthcoming about how you acquired the car," I suggested. "Your word as a gentleman doesn't carry much weight when you're facilitating the sale of property obtained through deception." Jack returned, pocketing his phone. "My father has instructed me to prepare the car for transport to Seattle," he announced. "Mrs. Carson will retain an ownership interest pending completion of payment arrangements to be finalized this weekend." Harold looked thunderstruck. "This is outrageous. The Weber family has done business with Peterson for years. His golf membership was sponsored by me, for God's sake." "I'm just following instructions, sir," Jack replied diplomatically. Ryan pulled me aside, his voice low and urgent. "Nat, think about what you're doing. This payment plan will drain you financially for years. Is it really worth it?" I looked at him, truly looked at the man I had married, and saw him with perfect clarity for perhaps the first time. "That you can even ask that question shows how little you understand me," I said softly. "How little you've ever understood what matters to me." "What about what matters to us?" he pressed. "Our marriage, our future?" "You should have thought about that before you stole my car," I replied. Harold interrupted our exchange. "Ryan, call your sister. Tell her the situation has changed. Her program payment will have to be delayed." Ryan paled. "But Dad, she's already en route to Arizona. The center won't admit her without full payment up front." "Then she'll have to turn around," Harold snapped. "Thanks to your wife's stubbornness, we have a crisis to manage." I laughed incredulously. "My stubbornness? That's rich, coming from the man who orchestrated this entire fiasco, rather than simply asking me for help with Valerie's latest crisis." "Would you have helped?" Ryan challenged. "Probably not," I admitted. "Not for another retreat. But I might have considered helping with her legitimate debts if you'd been honest about the situation. We could have found another solution. One that didn't involve betraying my trust and stealing my most precious possession." Ryan looked stricken, as if this possibility had never occurred to him. "I didn't think— That's the problem, isn't it?" I cut him off. "You didn't think about me at all. You only thought about what your father and sister wanted." Jack cleared, his throat awkwardly. "Mrs. Carson, if you could move your car so I can position the trailer properly, We can get the Mustang loaded. Reality crashed back in. Despite Peterson's compromise, I was still losing my car today. It would be traveling to Seattle, where it would remain until I could pay off a debt I never should have incurred in the first place. Of course, I said, moving toward my daily driver. As I shifted my car to make room for Jack's trailer, I watched Ryan and Harold in heated discussion by the garage. Their gestures were animated, faces flushed with anger. Not at each other, but at me, the outsider who had dared to disrupt their family's established patterns. The weight of what lay ahead settled over me. This was just the beginning of what promised to be a messy, painful reckoning, not just for the car, but for my marriage and my place in the Weber family dynamic. One thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The loading of the Mustang onto Jack's trailer was a surreal experience. Each movement felt like it was happening in slow motion, Jack carefully backing the trailer into position, the gentle rumble of the engine as he guided my car up the ramps, the methodical process of securing it with straps and wheel chocks. I watched with a hollow feeling in my chest, unable to tear my eyes away even as each moment cut deeper. Harold stood by, arms crossed, supervising the process with the stern expression of a man determined to assert control over a situation rapidly slipping from his grasp. Ryan hovered uncertainly between us, his posture tense, occasionally glancing at his constantly buzzing phone. "Valerie's freaking out," he muttered after checking yet another message. "The retreat center is threatening to give her spot to someone else if payment isn't confirmed in the next hour." "Not my problem," I replied, my voice flat. Ryan's expression hardened. "She's already there, Nat. She flew out this morning. If she can't check in, she'll be stranded in Arizona with nowhere to go. Perhaps one of her previous spiritual guides can offer accommodation," I suggested without sympathy. "Or she could do what most adults do when faced with financial limitations: get a hotel she can actually afford." "This isn't like you," Ryan said, his tone accusatory. "You've never been this cold." I turned to face him fully. "You've never stolen something irreplaceable from me before. People change when they're betrayed, Ryan. They develop protective barriers. They become cold to those who've harmed them." Before he could respond, Harold approached, his expression thunderous. "This is a disaster," he announced, as if we weren't all acutely aware of that fact. "Peterson is making a terrible mistake, and he'll regret it once his lawyers review the transaction." "His son seems to think otherwise," I countered, nodding toward Jack, who was now doing a final check of the straps securing the Mustang. "Jack is a sentimental fool," Harold dismissed. "Robert is a businessman. Once the emotional manipulation wears off, he'll realize this arrangement makes no financial sense." "Perhaps some people value ethics over profit," I suggested. Harold snorted derisively. "In the real world, Mrs. Carson, clean titles and legal paperwork trump sentimentality. The car was sold legally. This charade of a payment plan is nothing but a courtesy that can be withdrawn at any time." His words sent a chill through me. Was he right? Could Peterson change his mind once I arrived in Seattle, deciding the potential complications weren't worth the hassle? Jack approached, clipboard in hand. "All set," he announced. "Just need signatures on these transport documents." Harold immediately reached for the clipboard. "I'll handle this." "Actually," Jack said, holding the clipboard away from Harold's grasp, "I need Mrs. Carson's signature, since she's now listed as the interested party on my transport manifest." The small victory did little to ease the ache in my chest as I signed the forms. Each stroke of the pen felt like another farewell to the car that represented so much more than metal and rubber. "I'll take good care of her," Jack promised quietly, as I handed back the clipboard. "My dad's workshop is climate-controlled, and the car will be stored under a cover, not driven." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. Jack seemed to understand, offering a sympathetic smile before returning to his truck. As he prepared to depart, Ryan's phone rang. His face tightened as he checked the screen. "It's Valerie," he said, moving away to answer. I stood in the driveway, watching as Jack carefully maneuvered the truck and trailer toward the street. The Mustang gleamed in the afternoon sun, its Highland green paint capturing the light exactly as I'd envisioned when I'd selected the color 5 years ago. My father would have loved it. "It's beautiful," said a voice beside me. I turned to find Ryan, phone still in hand, watching the car with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "Yes," I agreed. "It is." "I never really understood how much work you put into it," he admitted. "How many hours, how much care. I just saw it as a hobby, something that kept you busy on weekends." "It was much more than that," I said softly. "It was my connection to my dad. It was therapy after losing him. It was proof that I could take something broken and make it whole again." Ryan's eyes met mine, and for an instant I glimpsed genuine remorse. "I'm sorry, Nat. I truly am. If I could go back and undo this— But you can't," I finished for him. "Some actions can't be undone. Some betrayals cut too deep." We stood, in silence as Jack's truck disappeared around the corner, taking with it the physical manifestation of 5 years of my life and countless memories of my father. Harold approached, his expression grimly determined. "Ryan, we need to address the Valerie situation. If she can't check into the retreat, we need to arrange emergency funds for accommodations and a return flight." Ryan nodded mechanically. "She's panicking, Dad. Says the center won't even let her wait in the lobby while we sort this out." "Use your credit card for a hotel tonight," Harold instructed. "I'll make some calls, see if I can secure a short-term loan to cover the retreat costs until this car fiasco is resolved." I laughed bitterly. "The car fiasco, as you call it, wouldn't exist if you hadn't decided to sell my property without my consent." Harold fixed me with a cold stare. "We did what was necessary for family, something you've clearly never understood." "Family?" I repeated incredulously. "Is that what you call this dysfunctional system you've created? Where Valerie's every whim is catered to at everyone else's expense? Where Ryan is manipulated into betraying his wife to please his father? That's not family, Harold. That's a cult of personality with you as the supreme leader." Harold's face flushed with anger. "How dare you speak to me that way, after everything we've done for you?" "What exactly have you done for me?" I challenged. "Name one thing you've ever done. That wasn't ultimately for your own benefit or Valerie's." His silence was telling. "That's what I thought," I said quietly. "Now, I'd appreciate it if you would leave my property. I have a lot to process, and your presence isn't helping." "Natalie," Ryan began, but I cut him off. "You too, Ryan. I need space to think about what happens next. For us, for our marriage, for everything." Harold bristled. "You can't dismiss my son from his own home." "Actually, I can," I corrected him. "The house is in my name only." Another decision that seems particularly prescient given recent events. Ryan looked shocked. "Nat, you can't be serious. Where am I supposed to go?" "The same place you disappeared to this morning when you couldn't face what you'd done," I suggested. "Your parents' house seems to be your preferred refuge when things get difficult." Harold placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder. "Come on, son. Let's give your wife some time to calm down and come to her senses." I watched as they retreated to Harold's BMW, Ryan casting one last conflicted glance over his shoulder before sliding into the passenger seat. As they drove away, the silence they left behind was almost deafening. I returned to the empty garage, the vacant space where my Mustang had stood just hours earlier, now a glaring reminder of everything I'd lost. My tools hung neatly on pegboards, the specialized equipment I'd invested in for the restoration project now without purpose. The folding chair where my father used to sit while supervising my early attempts at maintenance stood empty in the corner. For the first time since the morning's phone call, I allowed myself to truly feel the magnitude of the betrayal. The tears, came hot and fast, sobs wrenching from somewhere deep inside me. I sank onto the concrete floor, back against the wall, and let the grief wash over me. I wasn't just crying for the car. I was crying for the marriage I now realized had always been built on shaky ground, for the years I'd spent trying to earn acceptance from a family that would never truly welcome me, for the painful clarity that came with seeing Ryan's true priorities laid bare. How had I not seen it before? The signs had been there from the beginning. Ryan's reluctance to contradict his father, his automatic defense of Valerie's behavior, his discomfort with setting boundaries with his family. I had attributed these traits to loyalty, to the close-knit nature of the Weber clan. Now I recognize them for what they truly were: the deeply ingrained patterns of someone raised to prioritize family harmony over personal integrity. My phone buzzed with a text from Brandon. Heard from Peterson's lawyer. They're drafting payment agreement papers for Saturday meeting. Want me to review before you sign? At least something was proceeding as promised. I typed back a quick affirmative, grateful for this small certainty in the midst of so much chaos. As I gathered myself, wiping away tears with the back of my hand, my gaze fell on the workbench where I'd spent countless hours researching parts, making plans, and solving problems. My father's toolbox sat beneath it, the red metal worn but well-maintained. His name still visible in the white paint he'd used to mark it as his. Thomas Mitchell. "What would you do, Dad?" I whispered to the empty garage. Though no audible answer came, I could almost hear his voice in my head. "You rebuild, Natalie. When something breaks, you assess the damage, salvage what's worth keeping, and replace what's too far gone. Sometimes the result looks different than what you started with, but that doesn't mean it can't be beautiful." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. The path ahead was unclear, filled with difficult conversations and painful decisions. But one thing was certain: I would never again allow myself to be used or taken for granted by the Weber family. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call from an unknown number. I answered cautiously. "Mrs. Carson, this is Robert Peterson," came the now familiar gruff voice. "Mr. Peterson," I acknowledged, my guard immediately up. Was Harold right? Was he calling to renege on our arrangement? "I've been thinking about our conversation," he began, and my heart sank. "My son told me more about your situation, and about the car's significance to you." "Yes?" I prompted when he paused. "I've restored a lot of cars in my time," he continued. "Some for profit, some for the love of it. The ones that mean something personal, those are different. They carry stories that go beyond market value." I remained silent, unsure where he was headed. "I've instructed my lawyer to draw up a different agreement," Peterson said. "The car will remain as collateral, but I'm waiving the 10% fee. You'll pay back only what I paid for it. No interest, no additional charges." Relief washed over me. "That's very generous, Mr. Peterson." "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he replied, a hint of gruffness returning to his voice. "I'm still getting a valuable asset as security, but I know what it's like to have something that connects you to someone you've lost. That Thunderbird I mentioned, it's worth 3 times what I'm holding your Mustang for, but I wouldn't sell it for any price." After we ended the call, I sat for a long time in the empty garage, processing everything that had happened. The day had begun with betrayal and loss, yet somehow had led to this moment of unexpected grace from a stranger who understood the value of what had been taken from me. As the afternoon light slanted through the garage windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor, I realized I had reached a crossroads. The decisions I made in the coming days would shape not just my financial future, but the very nature of my relationships and my identity. The Mustang would eventually return to me, that much was now certain. But could my marriage be salvaged? Should it be? And if not, what would my life look like without Ryan and the Weber family dynamics that had dominated so much of my adult Life? For the first time since discovering the betrayal, I allowed myself to imagine a future defined by my own boundaries and priorities, rather than the Weber family's demands. The possibility was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. Whatever came next, one thing was clear: I would never again allow myself to be sacrificed on the altar of someone else's needs. The old Natalie might have eventually forgiven and forgotten for the sake of peace, might have swallowed her resentment and carried on as before. But that Natalie was gone. In her place stood a woman who had glimpsed the truth of her marriage and her in-laws' regard for her, and who could never unsee what had been revealed. The sun was setting as I finally rose from the garage floor, brushing dust from my jeans and straightening my shoulders. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult conversations, and painful choices. Tonight, I would allow myself to grieve what was lost. Not just a car, but the illusions I had built my life around. The house felt unnervingly quiet that evening. I'd grown accustomed to Ryan's presence, the sound of the television in the background, his footsteps on the stairs, the gentle clink of his wedding ring against his water glass. The silence now seemed to amplify the emptiness left by both his absence and the loss of my car. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open before me, a fresh pot of coffee brewing despite the late hour. Sleep was not an option. My mind raced with too many thoughts, too many decisions to be made. Instead, I channeled my energy into practical action, creating a plan to reclaim not just my car, but my autonomy. First, I needed to secure my finances. Ryan had already proven he couldn't be trusted with our shared resources. I logged into our remaining joint accounts and systematically transferred my portion of the funds to my personal account, one that Ryan had never had access to, where I deposited a percentage of each paycheck as my independence fund. My father had insisted I maintain this account even after marriage, wisdom I now appreciated more than ever. Never make yourself financially vulnerable, he'd advised when I announced my engagement. Even in the happiest marriages, having your own resources gives you freedom to make choices without pressure. Next, I drafted an email to my boss explaining that I needed to take Friday off for a personal emergency and would be working remotely the following week. Kate had always been understanding about personal matters, having navigated her own difficult divorce years earlier. Her response came quickly, despite the late hour. Take whatever time you need. Projects are covered. Let me know if you need anything else. One small weight lifted from my shoulders. At least my professional life remained stable amid the personal chaos. Around midnight, my phone rang, Ryan's name flashing on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, not yet ready for that conversation. He'd called 3 times since leaving and sent numerous texts ranging from apologetic to defensive to borderline accusatory. The latest read, "Val is checked into a motel near the retreat center. Dad had to wire emergency funds. This situation is causing massive stress for everyone. We need to talk about realistic solutions." His use of realistic grated on my nerves, as if my determination to reclaim my car was somehow irrational or impractical. As if I should simply accept the theft because undoing it was inconvenient for the Weber family. Ignoring the text, I turned my attention to the practical aspects of my upcoming trip to Seattle. I booked a hotel room near Peterson's workshop, reserved a rental car, and emailed Brandon the details so he could meet me there to review the paperwork before I signed. As I worked, an email notification appeared from my bank. Ryan had attempted to access our joint savings account, the one I'd just emptied. Minutes later, my phone buzzed with another text. "Did you transfer all our savings? That's our emergency fund." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. I typed back, "Apparently, we have different definitions of emergency. Mine doesn't include funding Valerie's spiritual journeys." His response came immediately. "This is petty and you know it. You're punishing everyone because you're angry about the car." I stared at the message, anger bubbling up inside me. Was he really that oblivious to the magnitude of his betrayal? Did he genuinely not understand that this was about far more than the Mustang? I typed carefully, "I'm protecting what's left of my assets from a husband who has proven he can't be trusted. That's not petty. It's self-preservation." When no response came, I returned to my planning. Around 2 a.m., I finally created a comprehensive to-do list for the coming days. Consult with Brandon about securing my remaining assets. Research marriage counselors, if reconciliation is even possible. Explore separation options as a contingency. Meet with Peterson and sign car agreement. Develop payment plan based on my income alone. Change all personal passwords and security questions. Pull credit reports to ensure no unknown joint debts. List felt coldly pragmatic, reducing the emotional devastation of my marriage to bullet points and action items. Yet there was something empowering about transforming pain into concrete steps, problems to be solved rather than merely suffered. As dawn broke, I moved from the kitchen to the living room window, watching as the neighborhood slowly came to life. Mr. Abernathy from across the street retrieving his newspaper, the Garcia twins waiting for their school bus, life continuing, its normal rhythms despite the seismic shifts in my world. My phone buzzed again. Not Ryan this time, but Diane. I answered against my better judgment, curiosity overriding caution. "Natalie," she began without preamble, her voice carrying its usual note of barely concealed impatience. "This situation has escalated beyond reason. We need to meet as a family to discuss a resolution." "Good morning to you too, Diane," I replied, intentionally using her first name rather than the mom she had always insisted upon. "What exactly do you hope to resolve?" "This car business, of course," she said dismissively. "And the money. You've apparently hidden from Ryan. Harold and I are hosting a family dinner tonight. We expect you at 7. The presumption was so typical that I almost laughed. "I won't be attending any family dinners, Diane. Not tonight, not in the foreseeable future." "This stubbornness is unbecoming," she chided, as if addressing a petulant child. "Family conflicts should be resolved within the family, not through lawyers and financial manipulation." "Interesting perspective," I observed. "Where was this concern for family resolution when you were planning to sell my car behind my back? Or when you were encouraging Ryan to lie to me about the title change?" Diane huffed indignantly. "That was different. Valerie had an immediate need that couldn't wait for lengthy discussions. And I have an immediate need to protect myself from further betrayal," I countered. "So it seems we're at an impasse. Natalie." Her voice took on the saccharine tone she reserved for particularly difficult manipulation attempts. "I understand. You're upset. But surely you can see that hanging on to anger only hurts you in the end. Forgiveness is the path to healing." "I'll consider forgiveness when I see genuine remorse and concrete changes," I replied evenly. "Until then, I'll focus on protecting what's mine." "Ryan is devastated," she pressed, changing tactics. "He barely slept last night, worried about your marriage. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" "Ryan should have considered our marriage before he stole from me," I said, my voice hardening. "His current distress is the natural consequence of his choices, not my responsibility to alleviate." A noise in the background interrupted whatever Diane had been about to say next. I heard muffled voices, then Harold's distinctive authoritative tone took over the call. "Natalie, this has gone far enough," he barked. "Your behavior is childish and destructive. You will return the money to the joint account immediately and join us for dinner tonight to discuss this situation like adults." The old Natalie might have been intimidated by his commanding tone, might have acquiesced to keep the peace, but that woman was gone. "Harold, let me be perfectly clear," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I will not be returning any money. I will not be attending your dinner. And I will not be taking orders from you or anyone else in this family ever again." "This is unacceptable," he blustered. You have obligations as Ryan's wife, as part of this family. My primary obligation is to myself, I interrupted. Something I've neglected for too long while trying to meet your family's endless demands. That ends now. I ended the call before he could respond, immediately silencing my phone as it began ringing again. The confrontation left me shaking, but oddly exhilarated. For perhaps the first time in my marriage, I had stood my ground against the Weber family pressure tactics without wavering or compromising. The doorbell rang just as I was pouring my third cup of coffee. Through the peephole, I saw Ryan standing on the porch, looking disheveled and exhausted. I considered ignoring him, but decided a face-to-face conversation was inevitable. Better to have it on my terms, when I was prepared, than be ambushed later. I opened the door but blocked the entrance. "What do you want, Ryan?" He looked startled by my directness. "Can I come in? It's my house, too." "Is it?" I asked. "You seemed pretty comfortable at your parents' place yesterday." "Nat, please," he sighed, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "I spent the night on their couch, barely slept. I just want to talk." After a moment's consideration, I stepped aside. He entered cautiously, as if crossing a boundary into foreign territory rather than coming home. In the kitchen, I poured him coffee without asking. One of those automatic gestures born from years of marriage. He accepted it gratefully, wrapping both hands around the mug as if seeking warmth. "Your mother called," I said, leaning against the counter rather than sitting down with him. "Apparently, I'm expected at a family dinner tonight to resolve this situation." Ryan winced. "I told them that was a bad idea, that you needed space. Yet here you are," I observed. "I'm not here as their emissary," he insisted. "I'm here as your husband, trying to save our marriage." I studied him over the rim of my coffee mug. "Is that what you want? To save our marriage?" "Of course it is," he replied, looking genuinely surprised by the question. "Nat, I know I messed up, badly, but we can get past this." "Can we?" I asked quietly. "Because from where I stand, you didn't just make a mistake, Ryan. You deliberately deceived me. You took something irreplaceable from me to solve a problem that wasn't even yours to fix." He stared into his coffee. "I know, and I'm sorry, truly sorry, but I felt trapped. Dad and Val were pressuring me, saying this retreat was her last chance, that if she didn't go, anything that happened to her would be on my conscience." "So you decided my feelings mattered less than theirs," I summarized, "that my connection to my father was an acceptable sacrifice for Valerie's latest attempt at self-improvement." "It wasn't like that," he protested weakly. "Then what was it like, Ryan? Explain it to me. Help me understand how my husband could betray me so completely and still expect our marriage to survive." He struggled visibly, opening and closing his mouth several times before finally speaking. "I've always been caught in the middle, between what my family expects and what you need, between their demands and our life together." He looked up, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I know I chose wrong this time. I let them pressure me into something unforgivable. But I'm not a bad person, Nat. I'm just flawed. Human." There was truth in his words. He had always been pulled between his family of origin and our marriage, never quite able to establish healthy boundaries with his parents and sister. But understanding the pattern didn't erase the damage done. "I've booked a hotel in Seattle for this weekend," I told him, changing the subject. "I'm meeting with Peterson and his lawyer to sign the agreement for buying back my car." Ryan straightened. "I should come with you. It's the least I can do." "No," I said firmly. "I need to do this alone. Brandon will be there to review the legal aspects." "Brandon?" Ryan frowned. "Your college friend? The lawyer?" "Yes." "So you've already involved a lawyer," he said, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. Are you planning to divorce me, Natalie? Is that what this is about? The question hung between us, heavy, with implication. Truth was, I didn't know the answer myself. I'm planning to protect myself, I replied carefully. Something I should have done long before now. Ryan set down his mug with deliberate control. I made a terrible mistake, Nat. But if you walk away from 10 years together over one bad decision— It wasn't just one decision, I interrupted. It was a pattern revealed by one decision. A pattern where your family's needs always trump mine, where my boundaries are seen as obstacles to overcome rather than lines to respect. He had no response to that, perhaps because he recognized the truth in it. I need time, I continued. Time to secure my car, to process what's happened, and to decide what comes next for us. If there is a next for us. Ryan nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of resignation and hope. What do you want me to do in the meantime? Stay with your parents, I suggested. Use this time to think about what kind of marriage you actually want. One where you're caught between two worlds, or one where you build proper boundaries with your family of origin. And if I choose the latter? He asked quietly. Then we'll have something to discuss when I return from Seattle, I replied, not committing to more than conversation. After Ryan left, I felt a curious lightness, despite the unresolved nature of our discussion. For years, I had contorted myself to fit into the Weber family dynamic, making allowances, swallowing resentments, compromising my needs to maintain harmony. Now, I was finally prioritizing myself, my car, my boundaries, my future. Whatever came next would be on my terms, not theirs. That alone felt like victory. The drive to Seattle on Saturday morning was therapeutic in its solitude. 5 hours of open road, my thoughts, and carefully selected music that avoided anything Ryan and I had shared. I deliberately left early, partly to avoid any last-minute Weber family interference, and partly to ensure I'd arrive fresh and clear-headed for my meeting with Peterson. My hotel was a modest business-class establishment near the industrial district where Peterson's workshop was located. After checking in and freshening up, I texted Brandon, who confirmed he was 30 minutes away. Everything was proceeding according to plan, a welcome change after days of chaos and uncertainty. Then my phone rang. Valerie's name flashed on the screen. In all our years of being sisters-in-law, Valerie had rarely called me directly. Our communication usually went through Ryan or occurred during family gatherings where interaction was unavoidable. This unprecedented direct contact sent warning signals through my system. Against my better judgment, I answered, "Hello, Valerie. Natalie." Her voice was thick, either from tears or deliberate emotional manipulation. With Valerie, it was impossible to tell. "I need to talk to you." "I'm listening," I replied neutrally. "I'm stranded in Arizona," she began, her words tumbling out. "In a rush. The retreat center wouldn't let me check in without full payment. The motel won't extend my stay without more money, and my return flight isn't for another 2 weeks." "That sounds like a challenging situation," I acknowledged, careful to keep any trace of satisfaction from my voice. "It's your fault," she accused, any pretense of seeking understanding evaporating. "If you hadn't been so selfish about that— Stupid car. I'd be starting my healing journey right now instead of sitting in a crappy motel room with nowhere to go." I took a deep breath, reminding myself that engaging with Valerie's emotional outbursts never led anywhere productive. "Valerie, I understand you're upset, but your current situation is the result of choices made by you, Ryan, and your parents, not me." "How can you be so cold?" she demanded. "I'm in crisis here. My therapist says this retreat is essential for my healing process. My trauma can't wait for your petty car issues to be resolved." The word trauma ignited something inside me. What exactly is your trauma, Valerie? Because from where I stand, you've led a charmed life with parents who cater to your every whim and a brother who's willing to destroy his marriage to fund your latest spiritual adventure. You have no idea what I've been through, she snapped. You're right, I don't, I conceded. Because in 10 years of being family, you've never actually specified what this mysterious trauma is. You've just used it as a blank check that everyone else is expected to cover. Her sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. Ryan was right. You really are heartless. No, Valerie. I'm just tired of being expected to sacrifice my needs for yours without question or complaint. I paused, gathering my thoughts. Why did you really call? What do you want from me? I need money for a flight home, she admitted after a moment of silence. Dad's trying to secure a loan, but it won't come through until Monday at the earliest. I can't stay here that long. Of course, it always came back to money with Valerie. I'm sorry, but I can't help you, I said firmly. I've already committed every spare dollar to reclaiming my car, the one that was sold without my consent. To fund your retreat, so you're just going to leave me stranded? Her voice rose incredulously. What kind of person does that? The kind who's finally setting boundaries, I replied calmly. Call your parents, call Ryan, call one of your spiritual guides or yoga instructors or crystal healers. I'm done being your safety net. I ended the call before she could launch into another tirade, immediately silencing my phone as it began ringing again. The confrontation left me shaking slightly, but with an overwhelming sense of liberation. For years, I had swallowed my true feelings about Valerie's parasitic relationship with her family, afraid of being labeled cold or unsupportive. Now, I had finally spoken my truth, and the world hadn't ended. My phone buzzed with a text notification. Ryan. Val just called me hysterical. What did you say to her? I typed back. The truth. Something your family has been avoiding for years. Before he could respond, Brandon arrived. His familiar face, with its perpetually amused expression and kind eyes, was a welcome sight after days of conflict. You look like hell, Nat, he greeted me with characteristic bluntness, pulling me into a brief hug. Thanks, I feel like it too, I admitted with a small laugh. Over coffee in the hotel lobby, I filled him in on the latest developments, including my conversation with Valerie. Brandon listened without interruption, only occasionally jotting notes in his small leather notebook. So the Weber circus continues, he observed when I finished. Any second thoughts about going through with this? It's a lot of money to take on solo. None, I said with certainty. That car is worth every penny, not just for its market value, but for what it represents. And Ryan? Any clarity there? I stirred my coffee absently. Less certain on that front. The betrayal feels fundamental. Like I've suddenly seen the real foundation of our marriage, and it's built on sand. Brandon nodded thoughtfully. Relationships can survive betrayal, but only with real work and genuine change. The question is whether Ryan's capable of actually separating from his family's dysfunction. Exactly, I agreed, and I'm not convinced he is. Our conversation was interrupted by a text from Robert Peterson's lawyer confirming our 2 p.m. meeting at the workshop. Brandon and I reviewed our strategy one final time before heading out, his sensible sedan following my rental car through Seattle's industrial district. Peterson's workshop turned out to be an unmarked warehouse that gave no indication of the automotive treasures it contained. Only a discreet security system and gleaming doors hinted at its true purpose. Jack met us outside, his friendly smile a reassuring presence in this unfamiliar territory. Mrs. Carson, he greeted me warmly. Good to see you again. Dad's inside with the paperwork already. The interior of the warehouse took my breath away. Classic cars in various stages of restoration filled the cavernous space. Corvettes, Thunderbirds, Camaros, and other vintage beauties arranged with museum-like precision. In the center of it all, under a protective cover, sat my Mustang. Robert. Peterson turned out to be an imposing figure. tall and broad-shouldered despite being in his 60s, with weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime of mechanical work. He greeted us with gruff courtesy, leading us to a small office area where his lawyer waited with documents spread across a conference table. "Mrs. Carson," Peterson nodded. "Your car arrived safely, as you can see. She's quite a piece of work. Excellent. Restoration." "Thank you," I replied, warmed by his professional appreciation. My father taught me well. As Brandon and Peterson's lawyer reviewed the paperwork, discussing terms and conditions in the specialized language of legal professionals, I found myself drawn back to the main floor, to my car. I approached slowly, almost reverently, and carefully lifted a corner of the cover to reveal the Highland green paint I had so meticulously applied. "You did all the work yourself?" Peterson asked, having followed me out of the office. "Every bit I could," I confirmed. "Contracted out the custom upholstery and some of the chrome work, but everything else was me." He nodded appreciatively. "Jack told me about the situation with your husband and in-laws. Shame when family complications touch something that special." "Yes," I agreed simply, not wanting to elaborate on my personal drama with this near stranger, regardless of his understanding. "My wife's family tried something similar once," he offered unexpectedly. "Her brother needed money for some investment scheme, convinced her parents I should liquidate my first restoration business to fund it." I looked up, surprised by this personal disclosure. "What happened?" "I refused," Peterson said with a slight smile. "Caused one hell of a family rift for a while. But eventually, they saw I was right when the brothers' sure thing went belly up." He shrugged. "Sometimes standing your ground is the only way to earn respect." Before I could respond, the workshop door opened with a bang. Harold Weber strode in, followed closely by Ryan, both looking like they'd driven through the night to reach Seattle. "There you are," Harold announced, as if I'd been hiding rather than exactly where I'd said I would be. "This charade ends now." Peterson straightened, instantly alert. "Sir, this is private property. You can't just barge in here." "I'm Harold Weber," he declared, as if the name alone should grant him access. "I'm here to resolve a family matter that never should have reached this point." "Mr. Weber," Peterson replied coolly, "I'm familiar with who you are. Your family issues don't concern me. What does concern me is your uninvited presence in my workshop." Ryan approached me, ignoring the tension between the older men. "Nat, please, this has gone far enough. Come home with me. We can work this out without throwing away tens of thousands of dollars." "How did you even know where to find me?" I asked, genuinely baffled by their sudden appearance. Ryan had the grace to look embarrassed. "I installed a tracking app on your phone last year, for safety." The violation hit me like a physical blow. "You've been tracking my movements without my knowledge?" "Only when I was worried about you," he defended weakly. Harold interrupted our exchange. "Peterson, I want to speak with you privately, man to man." "There's nothing to discuss," Peterson replied firmly. "I have a business agreement with Mrs. Carson that's about to be formalized. Your presence here changes nothing." Harold's face reddened. "Do you realize what you're doing? Inserting yourself into a family matter, enabling a wife's vindictive behavior toward her husband?" "What I realize," Peterson said evenly, "is that I'm conducting a legitimate business transaction with a woman whose property was sold without her consent. The family dynamics behind that are not my concern." Brandon and Peterson's lawyer emerged from the office, clearly drawn by the commotion. Brandon assessed the situation quickly, moving to stand supportively beside me. "Mr. Weber," he said, "formally, your presence here could be construed as harassment and interference with a legitimate business transaction. I suggest you leave before this becomes a legal matter." Harold scoffed. "And who exactly are you?" "Brandon Mitchell, attorney for Mrs. Carson," he replied smoothly. and you are trespassing on private property after tracking my client's location. Without her consent. Ryan stepped forward, hands raised placatingly. We're not here to cause trouble. We just want to talk. To find a solution that doesn't involve Natalie taking on massive debt. The time for talking was before you sold my car, I pointed out. Before you emptied our savings. Before you betrayed my trust in the most fundamental way possible. I've apologized for that, Ryan exclaimed. What more do you want from me? The question hung in the air, its simplicity belying the complexity of what had been broken between us. What did I want from him? Genuine remorse? Concrete changes in his relationship with his family? The strength to finally stand up to his father and sister? Before I could formulate a response, Harold made a tactical error. Peterson, he said, his voice taking on the condescending tone he used when he believed he held the upper hand. I understand you're a businessman. So let's talk business. Whatever profit margin you're expecting from this arrangement with Natalie, I'll double it. In cash. Today. The naked attempt at bribery shocked even Ryan, who turned to stare at his father in disbelief. Dad, what are you doing? Peterson's expression hardened. Mr. Weber, I think you should leave now. Voluntarily, before I have security escort you out. You're making a mistake, Harold warned. The Webers aren't people you want as enemies in this community. Fortunately for me, I do business across the country, Peterson replied dryly. Your local influence means very little in my world. As if summoned by the rising tensions, two burly men in workshop uniforms appeared at Peterson's side. Security staff who had clearly been monitoring the situation. Harold assessed the odds, his expression calculating. Finally, he turned to Ryan. Come on, son. We're leaving. This isn't over. Ryan hesitated, looking at me with a mixture of confusion and hurt. Nat, please, at least talk to me privately before you sign anything. I considered refusing, but realized that closure, whatever form it took, required this final conversation. 5 minutes, I conceded. Outside. Peterson nodded understanding as I followed Ryan to the parking lot, maintaining a careful distance between us. The Seattle afternoon was surprisingly clear, sunlight glinting off the cars in the lot. You're really going through with this? Ryan asked once we were alone. Taking on all this debt just to prove a point? It's not about proving a point, I corrected him. It's about reclaiming something that should never have been taken from me in the first place. I know I messed up, he acknowledged, running a hand through his hair in that familiar gesture of frustration. But this response feels disproportionate, like you're punishing me instead of trying to fix our marriage. I studied his face, the face I had woken up to for a decade. The face I had once believed I'd grow old, seeing across the breakfast table. There was genuine confusion there, a complete inability to grasp the magnitude of what had been broken. That's the problem, Ryan, I said quietly. You still don't understand what you did. You see this as an overreaction to a mistake, not a natural consequence of a profound betrayal. Then help me understand, he pleaded. Tell me what I need to do to make this right. The sincerity in his voice almost weakened my resolve. Almost. I don't think you can, I admitted. Not because I don't want to forgive you, but because the patterns that led to this moment are too deeply ingrained in who you are. Your loyalty will always be to your family of origin first. My needs will always come second to Valerie's wants. That's not true, he protested. I love you, Nat. You're my wife. Yes, I agreed sadly. I am your wife, but I'm not your priority. I never have been. Harold honked impatiently from his car, the jarring sound a perfect punctuation to our failing marriage. Ryan glanced over his shoulder, then back at me, unconsciously revealing exactly where his attention was pulled. I need to go sign those papers, I said, taking a step back. Goodbye, Ryan. I turned and walked back toward the workshop, each step both painful and liberating. Behind me, I heard Ryan call my name once more before the sound of a car door. Closing signaled his choice, as always, to follow his father. Inside, Brandon, Peterson, and the lawyer waited patiently, the paperwork still spread across the conference table. No one commented on the scene that had just unfolded or asked what had transpired outside. "I'm ready to sign," I said simply, picking up the pen. As I wrote my name on line after line, I felt a curious sense of rightness settle over me. The path ahead would be difficult, financially strained, emotionally complex, professionally challenging, as I balanced work with the logistics of separation. But it would be my path, shaped by my choices rather than the Weber family's demands. The Mustang would return to me once the payment plan was completed. In the meantime, I would rebuild my life piece by piece, just as I had rebuilt that car, with patience, determination, and an unwavering vision of the end result. Some things, once broken, could be restored to their former glory. Others needed to be recognized as irreparable and respectfully laid to rest. As I signed the final document, I knew with absolute clarity which category my marriage fell into. 6 months passed with the steady rhythm of healing and rebuilding. The seasons changed from winter's chill to spring's tentative warmth, reflecting my own gradual transformation from bewildered betrayal to purposeful independence. The separation from Ryan was finalized 3 weeks after my return from Seattle. He had appeared at the house with his father and a family lawyer in tow, clearly expecting a battle over assets and terms. Instead, he found me calmly reasonable, focused on equity rather than retribution. The house would be sold, proceeds split evenly after the mortgage was paid. Retirement accounts would remain with their respective owners. The only non-negotiable item was the Mustang. It would remain solely mine, along with the responsibility for its payments. His surprise at my composed approach was almost comical. The Weber family operated on conflict and drama, wielding emotional manipulation like a finely honed weapon. My refusal to engage on those terms left them off balance, unsure how to respond to rational discussion rather than heated argument. "You're being remarkably civil about all this," Ryan had commented as we signed the preliminary separation papers. "This isn't about punishment, Ryan," I'd replied quietly. "It's about moving forward with dignity." Harold had been less impressed with my approach. "You're making a grave mistake," he'd warned as they prepared to leave. "Ryan is the best thing that ever happened to you." "No, Harold," I'd corrected him gently. "Self-respect is the best thing that ever happened to me. Something I rediscovered when your family pushed me too far." I'd moved into a small apartment closer to my office, embracing the fresh start, despite the financial strain of maintaining both rent and the monthly payments to Peterson. My engineering firm had been understanding about my situation, even offering me additional project work to supplement my income during this transitional period. The empty space where a spouse should be was occasionally painful, particularly during quiet evenings or when facing minor household problems that Ryan would have handled. But the absence of the Weber family drama from my life created a peaceful environment I hadn't experienced in years. No more walking on eggshells around Valerie's latest crisis. No more enduring Diane's subtle critiques of my housekeeping or career choices. No more fielding Harold's intrusive financial questions. The freedom was worth every moment of loneliness. Monthly payments to Peterson continued like clockwork, each one bringing me closer to reclaiming my Mustang. We'd developed an unexpected rapport during this arrangement, with occasional texts exchanged about restoration techniques or rare parts he'd discovered. Jack sometimes sent photos of my car, carefully stored under its protective cover in the Seattle workshop, a silent promise waiting to be fulfilled. I had visited twice to check on the Mustang and make payments in person. Peterson preferred cash when possible, offering a small discount for the inconvenience of the drive. During my second visit, he'd invited me to tour his latest projects, treating me as a fellow enthusiast rather than merely a debtor. His respect for my knowledge and craftsmanship was a balm to the lingering ache of Ryan's betrayal. News of the Weber family reached me occasionally through mutual friends or community connections. Valerie had returned from Arizona without completing her retreat, apparently having found the program not aligned with her authentic spiritual path. She had moved back in with Harold and Diane, launching a home-based crystal business that her parents had predictably financed. Ryan had thrown himself into work, earning a promotion but also developing what friends described as a concerning pattern with alcohol. He dated casually but nothing serious, and apparently spoke of our separation as temporary, despite the divorce proceedings moving steadily forward. Diane had taken to portraying herself as the supportive mother-in-law, blindsided by an ungrateful daughter-in-law's abandonment of her son. Her carefully curated social media posts hinted at family healing and forgiveness, always with the unspoken implication that the door remained open for my return once I worked through my issues. Harold had encountered business difficulties, losing a significant client after a disagreement that had apparently been witnessed by several prominent community members. The Weber family's once unquestioned social standing had developed cracks, though they remained fixtures at the country club and community events. None of this information brought me joy or sorrow. I had detached from the Weber family saga, their troubles and triumphs equally irrelevant to my new life. My energy was focused entirely on moving forward, building my career, strengthening friendships that had withered under the demands of Weber family obligations, and rediscovering passions that had been set aside to accommodate Ryan's preferences. I had even begun dating again, cautiously. Nothing serious, just occasional dinners with men who treated me with respect and genuine interest. The contrast between these interactions and my marriage was illuminating, highlighting patterns I had accepted as normal that were anything but. On a crisp fall morning, exactly 8 months after signing the agreement with Peterson, I received a call that changed everything. "Mrs. Carson, Robert Peterson here." "Mr. Peterson," I greeted him warmly. "Is everything all right with the car?" "The car's perfect," he assured me. "That's not why I'm calling. My situation has changed. I'm selling the workshop and moving to Florida. Doctor says the damp Seattle climate isn't doing my arthritis any favors." My heart sank. Would the new workshop owner honor our agreement? Would my car be lost in the transition? "What does this mean for our arrangement?" I asked cautiously. "That's why I'm calling," Peterson replied. "I'd like to close out our agreement early. You've made 8 payments so far, all on time. That's about a third of the total amount due." "I don't have the remaining balance available immediately," I said, mind racing through financial options. "Could I secure a loan? Liquidate my modest investments?" "I'm not asking for the full balance," Peterson surprised me by saying. "I'm prepared to consider our agreement fulfilled with one final payment of $5,000. I nearly dropped the phone. "5,000? But that would mean you're forgiving over $25,000 of the remaining balance." "Consider it my retirement gift to myself," Peterson said gruffly. "I don't need the hassle of managing payment plans from Florida." He began, then paused, gathering his thoughts. "I think you were right about a lot of things. About Val, about my parents, about how I let them influence our marriage." The admission was surprising. Ryan had rarely questioned his family's dynamics during our years together. "That's growth," I acknowledged. "Too little, too late?" he asked, a hint of his old wry humor surfacing briefly. "For us? Yes," I said honestly, "but perhaps not for your future." He accepted this with a nod. "I've started therapy, trying to understand why I can't say no to them, why I value their approval over everything else." He hesitated. "I wish I'd done it years ago. Maybe things would have been different." "Maybe," I agreed, though I wasn't entirely convinced. Some patterns run too deep for easy transformation. We parted with an awkward embrace that felt like genuine closure. the final acknowledgement that our paths had irreversibly diverged. That evening, I drove my Mustang along the coastal highway as the sun set, the engine's powerful rumble a soundtrack to my thoughts. The wind whipped through my open window, carrying away the last vestiges of doubt and regret. The past year had cost me a marriage, financial security, and the comfort of the familiar, but it had given me something far more valuable: the unshakable knowledge that I would never again allow myself to be diminished, manipulated, or used by those who claimed to love me. The road stretched before me, illuminated by headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. I had no specific destination in mind, no timeline for return, just the open road, a tank full of gas, and the freedom to choose my own direction. My father had been right all those years ago when he taught me about cars. They don't lie about what they need, and they reward you for paying attention. The same, I had discovered, was true of relationships. I had finally learned to pay attention to what I needed, to recognize when those needs weren't being met, and to value myself enough to walk away when necessary. As I navigated a curve in the coastal road, the horizon opened up to reveal the vast Pacific, silver blue in the fading light. I eased off the accelerator, allowing myself to fully absorb the moment, the purr of the engine my father had taught me to rebuild, the solid feel of the steering wheel beneath my hands, the endless possibility of the road ahead. I was no longer defined by my relationship to the Weber family or by what had been taken from me. I was defined by what I had reclaimed: my car, my independence, my self-respect. And no one would ever take those from me again. And frankly, Mrs. Carson, I've come to respect how you've handled this whole situation. Standing up to your in-laws took guts. Emotion welled up unexpectedly. I don't know what to say, Mr. Peterson. Say you'll come get your car next weekend, he replied practically. I need to clear the workshop by the end of the month. The following Saturday found me on the familiar drive to Seattle, this time with a cashier's check for $5,000 in my purse and a rented car trailer, hitched to a truck I'd borrowed from a colleague. Brandon accompanied me, partly for moral support and partly as legal witness to the final transfer of ownership. Peterson's workshop was nearly empty when we arrived, most of his collection already sold or transported to his new Florida home. But in the center of the cavernous space, freed from its protective cover, sat my Mustang, gleaming under the overhead lights, looking exactly as it had the day it was taken from me. She's been started weekly and moved around the shop to keep everything in working order, Peterson explained as he handed me the keys. Oil was changed last month. She's ready to go home. The moment was charged with a significance that transcended the simple return of property. This car represented not just my connection to my father, but my reclamation of personal power. Every payment had been a declaration of independence. Every month of financial sacrifice, a statement about what I valued and who I was. As I completed the paperwork and handed over the final check, Peterson offered his hand. It's been a pleasure doing business with you, Mrs. Carson. Your father would be proud of the work you did on this car and the backbone you've shown these past months. The drive home with my Mustang securely fastened to the trailer was a journey of quiet triumph. Each mile represented distance not just from Seattle, but from the life I had left behind. A life where my needs were secondary, my boundaries routinely violated, my value measured in what I could provide to others rather than who I was. The following week, the divorce was finalized without fanfare or drama. Ryan attended the brief court proceeding alone, Harold and Diane conspicuously absent after their earlier threats to contest every aspect of the separation. He approached me afterward in the courthouse hallway, looking thinner and older than I remembered. I heard you got your car back, he said, his tone carefully neutral. Yes, I confirmed, last weekend. He nodded, eyes fixed on some distant point. Dad's furious about Peterson cutting you a deal. Says it validates your unreasonable behavior. I couldn't help but smile at the predictable response. And what do you think, Ryan? The question seemed to catch him off guard. I think Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.